Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
It is the one game that truly belongs to the world. Its golden moments etched forever in the minds of fans from all nations, all cultures, all beliefs. Throughout the world, soccer is more than just a game. It's a passion. When they perform in soccer's marquee events, the stars of the world's game are players in a global drama. In 1994, the United States was the stage for a riveting story when America hosted the World Cup. Billions around the world watched as a determined American squad exceeded expectations. Born was a new generation of stars, homegrown heroes whose careers began on neighborhood fields in youth soccer programs. John Harkes, Tony Meola, and Alexi Lalas. They serve as the inspiration for today's young soccer players as they master their skills. As they practice and play, they dream of one day wearing the American red, white, and blue in a World Cup match. The World Cup provided the spark, and now it's time for the world's game to take its next step in the United States.
The building blocks have been laid for the most ambitious coast-to-coast professional soccer league in American history.
And history is made today. ESPN presents the inaugural game of Major League Soccer. A record sellout crowd of 32,000 here at Spartan Stadium in San Jose, California, to witness the first regular season game of the brand new league. Fireworks are capping off today's festive opening ceremonies, the crowd settling in. The stars have arrived to realize the dream for a new beginning in American soccer. Alan Rothenberg and João Havilan's two of the biggest men in U.S. and international soccer history. I'm Phil Shane. Welcome. Along with Kai Keogh, we have the honor of bringing you all of the MLS action this year. This is a dream come true for many fans and players alike.
This is the birth of a new era in American soccer, but most importantly, it's a homecoming for the USA's players who've been forced to hone their talents overseas. Now, they've proven their skills very impressively at the 1994 World Cup held in the United States, and even more impressively in 1995 at the Copa America. With the establishment of this Division I professional league, the USA's players will have the opportunity to become stars in front of the American people on their home soil.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right. My name is Tim Hanlon. This is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports, and I welcome you to the proceedings. How's it going, everybody? Hope your 2025 is off to a wonderful start. Let's try to keep it that way. With an episode this week that I think is quintessential for this little genre that we've carved out for ourselves over the last number of years, and I'm excited to bring it to you. Our guest this week is a gentleman by the name of Jim Paglia, and if you're a soccer nerd like me, you may remember that name from some previous conversations we've had about the Rochester Lancers of the old North American Soccer League. Jim was part of the management team there. Got his introduction to pro sports back in the day when they were a fledgling / floundering team in that league. Went on to other really interesting perches out there, including being the organizer for the Chicago portion of the 1994 World Cup when the United States hosted that monstrosity. But the conversation with Jim this week is a telling one, and we've got to set it up with that first game of Major League Soccer's history, which you just heard there. Of course, that was the ESPN coverage with Phil Shane and Tai Keogh calling on April 6th, 1996, the first ever Major League Soccer game, that between DC United and the San Jose Clash at a sold-out Spartan Stadium. Yours truly was there, but I digress. And that was part of the deal that FIFA made with the U.S. Soccer Federation back in the late 80s, very early part of the early 1990s. Was that in part of the arrangement for the United States getting the World Cup in 1994 was to finally reestablish a professional soccer league in the wake of what used to be a league that went kaput in 1984-85, the old North American Soccer League. But as we'll hear in our conversation with Jim Paglia, our guest this week, Major League Soccer was not a given in the lead up to the World Cup. And even frankly, after, for the first few months afterwards, there were a number of competing organizations all trying to gain favor with the U.S. Soccer Federation, the governing body of soccer in the United States, to get that Division I charter and become that league that FIFA was demanding in return for a World Cup. And Jim was part of one of those groups. And that's why we start with that Major League Soccer game, because this is a story of what if. What if things had gone a little differently? I'm going to beg your indulgence, and including the indulgence of Pablo Maurer, one of our previous guests, which you need to listen to from about a year and a half ago. Just a wonder of investigative reporting about the old things in soccer history in the United States. But he wrote an article that brought this story back to light for me and a number of other soccer people. And I, because of that article, reached out to Jim. Luckily, he said yes to this conversation. But let me set this up. Go find the article. It was on in The Athletic, Pablo's column, November 14th of last year. And I'm going to use it as a setup, if you don't mind. And here goes, with all apologies to Pablo if I mess up on the words. But the history of soccer in the United States, he begins, is littered with failed leagues, all attempting to do the same thing: Americanize the world's game. For nearly a century, proponents of the sport in the United States altered the long-standing rules of the game to make it more high-scoring, more action-packed, less foreign. Some of those rule changes and innovations, the use of substitutes, for example, or the back pass law, were truly groundbreaking and ended up being adopted globally. Others, including the 35-yard shootout and countdown clock, were interesting ideas that eventually fell by the wayside. And then there were the truly atrocious ideas: larger goals, stampede kicks, and brown cards for flatulence. He may have thrown in there that, I don't know if that's true or not, but I digress. Back to the quote. In the early 1990s, around the time the United States was preparing to host its first World Cup, Chicago area businessman Jim Paglia made an attempt to fully rework the rules of soccer. His concept, which he dubbed League One America, made the mascots, cheerleaders, and rule changes of previous leagues look staid and traditional. Paglia's game would be played on a pitch ringed with buzzers and lights, and players would wear skin-tight body stockings embedded with microchips. 8 officials would keep watch as participants launched shots at 4 different goals. They would play in futuristic stadiums built into shopping malls in every corner of the United States. It sounds like a fever dream, but in 1993, Paglia's idea grew legs. He earned an audience with FIFA, the sport's global governing body, and with the U.S. Soccer Federation. He crisscrossed the United States in search of funding, and major corporations expressed interest. He went head-to-head with the group organizing Major League Soccer in an attempt to earn Division I sanctioning, and got a crash course in the complicated insular politics of American soccer. And then it all fell apart. Nowadays, the remnants of League One America live in a box in Paglia's attic, a forgotten afterthought in the history of the sport in the country, while MLS has become the most successful professional soccer league in U.S. history. Flipping through those documents makes for a fun thought exercise. What if all of this had played out differently? And again, that's from the article that Pablo Maurer wrote back in November for The Athletic, called Body Stockings, Buzzers, Microchips, League One America, the failed attempt to revolutionize soccer. And that is the discussion topic today with our guest this week, that very founder behind that idea, Jim Paglia, a wonderfully revelatory conversation. Jim is a soccer guy. He cut his teeth with the old Rochester Lancers of the NASL back in the day in the 1970s. He was chairman of the World Cup Chicago committee for 1994, from 1987 to 91, in the preparation for Chicago's bid and ultimate assignment as one of the cities, showcase cities for 1994 World Cup, including the opening game of that tournament. He's been involved with women's soccer on various levels, and has been part of the marketing and advertising community in Chicago and other places as well. So this is a marketing guy, a soccer guy, a guy who kind of knows what's going on. And as you'll hear in our conversation coming up, some ideas that sound admittedly wacky as we set this conversation up, but actually had some very strong influence and have wound up becoming mainstream thinking today. In particular, as you'll hear, the idea less around sort of the rule tinkering with the game itself on the pitch, although that's an interesting story in and of itself. And Lord knows there have been many, many, many different attempts, indoors and outdoors, to spice up the game to, I guess, quote unquote, more American tastes over the years. A lot of Jim's concepts revolved around the commercialization of the sport, including the very early ideas of soccer-specific stadiums and stadiums that were part of larger developments, such as including retail and perhaps living accommodations and apartments and condos and those kinds of things. Mixed-use development, if you will, we call in today's real estate jargon. And there's no greater trend right now, interestingly enough, than mixed use when it comes to cajoling and maybe more local authorities to commit public funds to various stadium projects. And nobody has frankly been more at the forefront of that than Major League Soccer has been over the last couple of decades. So it's a very interesting circle of life around the story of soccer and the professional game, the commercialization of such, and the rooting, if you will, or the rerouting of an American professional league in the sport. All of that and more, lots of interesting twists and turns. This is a phenomenal conversation with our guest this week, Jim Paglia. And I'm not going to waste any more time. There's nothing more to promote. Here's our conversation we had just a couple of weeks before the holidays, and I am pleased to present it to you now. I hope you enjoy it. I am forever fascinated with teams and leagues and all those kinds of things that are either defunct or previously domiciled or relocated or other cul-de-sacs of history. And the NASL was my gateway drug, which in the specifically the New York Cosmos, the arch rival to the Lancers. So it's fascinating to me, and as a soccer nerd, maybe. And a longtime fan of the game in this country, which is itself saying something. The League One America is something that it's always been out there on my peripheral horizon as something that I knew existed for a fleeting period of time, but never really understood kind of all the dynamics of it. And Pablo's article, but also that article that was in The Guardian about 10 years ago or 8 years ago, who was it? Jack Williams, who wrote that too. It's endlessly fascinating. And when I saw the article pop up, I said, I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to try to figure out where this guy is and see if he wants to still talk. So if I haven't scared you away yet, what do you say?
Yeah, I'm always open to the conversation, but I'm always fascinated by why it's still a topic of interest. It's, it was a failed business venture decades ago, and yet people still are curious about how we did it and what we did and why we didn't succeed.
Well, okay. So I guess I want to give you a break, right? Because I don't think it's necessarily a quote unquote failure per se, because I think it's really important to kind of understand the dynamics of what was going on around that time. And frankly, understanding perhaps the earnestness and in some respects, right, to your credit, a bit of a foresight into how the business modeling of this professional soccer thing might look in order not to fail as the NASL had done. But before we get to the meat of the matter, how about a little bit of background about how you sort of found yourself at the precipice of, I guess, the battle for a renewed professional soccer league in the United States in the early 1990s, because you actually had soccer experience back in the old NASL days, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I actually started in baseball, minor league baseball, AAA in Rochester, New York, working for the Rochester Red Wings. And the fellow that I considered my mentor, a guy named Sam Lippa, Sam left the Red Wings to go to work for the Lancers. He stayed 2 weeks. He hated it. And he went back to the Red Wings, but he brought me with him, and I decided to stay. Mr. Petrosi, John Petrosi, who owned the team at the time, offered me Sam's job. So I went from Sam's assistant to replacing Sam.
And that job was roughly doing what?
The title was business manager. We had a general manager, but the general manager was also kind of our coach. He had been the coach of the team and got promoted to general manager, but was still heavily influencing the players and the way that the team advanced. So I got to be business manager, and that basically meant I was out pounding the pavement every day, selling ads in the program and trying to find sponsors for each of the games, that kind of thing. And through that, I really took it, not because I was interested in staying in soccer, but I loved working for Mr. Petrosi. He was a brilliant man. He owned scores of corporations. I mean, he probably owned 30 or 40 corporations, and they were almost all significant. He owned, I don't know how many dozens of thoroughbreds in various locations in Canada and the United States. So I really admired him and wanted to do anything he wanted me to do. And his deal was, at first, I had to split my time between painting the hallways of the office building where the Lancers were based and working for the Lancers, selling advertising space. And I did it willingly. So half a day I was in overalls painting, and half a day I was in a business suit out selling ads. And then eventually he said, okay, put the paintbrush away. You're going to do this full time. And that was really my introduction.
What year was this? And this was, I'm assuming this was after the Lancers had become full-fledged members of the almost dead but resuscitating NASL. Right?
That is correct. And I'm guessing it was in around 72. Well, I could be wrong about the year, but somewhere in that neighborhood, because I wasn't out of high school very long. I was maybe 19, 20 years old at the time. Something like that, maybe 21. I don't remember exactly, but I'd been there. As I said, I started in baseball and moved over into soccer with my mentor, and he decided he didn't want to stay. So I ended up getting his job. And Mr. Petrosi gave me free rein. It was like, just make it happen. He never questioned it. He was a very stern man and not a great communicator, very, very private. But I would meet him for breakfast every morning in the building that he owned where we were officed. We would eat in a little cafe down there. He'd give me my marching orders for the day, and that was it. And then he'd leave me alone.
Why did he own this team? And what did you think success meant in working for him in this thing called soccer and a professional league at that?
He bought it for his wife. She likes sports.
Oh, that's probably the best answer ever, right?
Yeah, she loves sports. I never met the woman. I never met her. And yet he bought the team for her. He bought a professional lacrosse team as well for her. And I never saw her at any of the games for either of those teams. So I don't know what was behind it all, other than he told me that's why he bought it. He was not a soccer fan himself, didn't know much about the game. And was kind of a frustrated owner. I guess that's how I would describe it. He regretted having purchased that team from the previous owners and keeping them involved. they were a nuisance to him. There was a group of owners, and he didn't care for them, and they were constantly trying to interject. And they loved telling people they still owned the team, even though they had a fraction of an interest as a group. I mean, they didn't have much of an interest in the team, but he allowed all of that. He was a very passive guy in some ways. If people wanted to brag they owned the Lancers, he let them get away with it.
What was it, a community pride thing between that and the Griffins of the I guess the fledgling National Lacrosse League at that time?
I guess I never quite understood. I mean, I understood why he had the lacrosse team, and that was to make his wife happy. But I never understood why he bought the soccer team. He'd come to the games. He traveled with the team, and he wasn't in good health, so it was difficult for him to get around. But he went to every game. He'd get frustrated when they lose, show a modicum of joy when they won. He was an interesting guy, and he kind of left it. Sal DeRosa was the general manager at the time, and he kind of left the running of it and the picking of the players and all that to Sal. It was an investment to Mr. Petrosi. I don't know why else he bought it. I mean, we were in the same building. We met with him almost on a daily basis. And I met with him every day. There was never any question about that. He'd always have a laundry list of things for me to do. But in the end, I don't know that he was as engaged an owner. As an example, they would have league owner meetings. He wouldn't go. He just didn't want to deal with those people. And so he would send me, and that would anger the other people. Clive Toy and the owners are representatives of all the major other teams. They would get so angry that this kid was sent in the place of John Petrosi, but he just wouldn't go to the meeting. So I did.
That's really interesting, and I think most fans of the old NASL would remember lovingly. I think the Rochester Lancers is essentially the Green Bay Packers of the NASL, and as the league grew, and arguably got too big for its britches by the end of the decade. A Rochester didn't seem to be kind of it was more of a tolerance, I guess, by that point than anything else. That said. An amazing franchise in the history of that league. What did you learn in that process about the sport? Because obviously something stuck with you years later. I'm curious as to what you were learning at the time, operationally and functionally, career ideation wise. What did you do thereafter from all of that? It wasn't obviously sticking with soccer per se, but you were learning some lessons that we'll talk about as this story plays out.
Well, Mr. Petrosi was such a role model for me that it was his business habits and behaviors that I picked up from him that meant the most to me. He had an assistant, a woman he called his secretary by the name of Midge Costanza. Midge Costanza went to work for Jimmy Carter in the White House. She then went on and became a professor. And I'm trying to remember what university, but Midge had an outstanding career. But she started as Mr. Petrosi's secretary, and that's what she did right out of high school. And I met her early on in my time with the Lancers, and she said to me, "You hitch your star to his wagon, or your wagon to his star, I'm sorry, and you'll see that you're going to go places." And I did that. I said, okay, wherever he wants me to go, whatever he wants me to do, that's what I'm going to do. And it was very painful for me when I left the Lancers. He was in ill health, passed away shortly after that. I would have stayed there forever if he had. And Mitch convinced me, just do whatever this guy wants you to do because he will take you far. And I learned more from him than I have all of the other employers and colleagues that I worked with in my entire career.
And where did that set you off to? What were your next steps? And then maybe how you got back into the soccer thing by the mid to late 80s? Because that's obviously an interesting set of seeds, shall we say, for the League One story. Did you stay in promotional and sports operational stuff? Because it seems like you have a lot of marketing and other things in your background too.
Yeah, I left sports, after being with the Red Wings and the Lancers, there weren't too many other places to go in Rochester. Those were the two teams, basically. So I went at the insistence of a television personality that I met along the way. He said, you should get into advertising. And I didn't really know what that meant, but I took an interview that he set up for me, and I ended up working at an ad agency in the most junior position the agency had, and worked my way up. And eventually I was running the regional McDonald's business. And people in Oak Brook, where McDonald's is headquartered, got wind of all of my efforts and asked me to move to Chicago to lead a big portion of their national public relations business. And so I did that. And that's where I ended up, was Chicago. And I went through, I stayed with their PR firm for a while. Then I went through a couple of other agencies on the ad side. I missed advertising, so I went back to that, ran the Taco Bell business nationally for a while and a couple of other big accounts, and then said, all right, I'm going to do this for myself. And went into business with a woman, and we had a firm called Tassani and Paglia for about 10 years. And then I decided I don't want to be in a big agency anymore. I didn't like having employees. I didn't like all those people around. I wanted to work alone, and I wanted to work on projects that really excited me. So I opened my own consulting business that I've had for almost 30 years now.
There you go. Well, that strikes a chord with yours truly, because I started my career humbly at Leo Burnett back in the day, and have gone through the big agency holding company sort of thing. And it gets a little less fun. Sorry, it gets a lot less fun as it gets bigger and more corporate. And it only got worse, frankly, in the years after that, as they became publicly traded and all that kind of stuff. But I digress.
No, I can stay with that for a second. I dated a girl from Burnett for a number of years, and every night she'd come home crying. Every night. And I said to her, get another job. She did not enjoy the agency world, and particularly the role she had there. I think they're a very admirable agency, but agency life is a altogether different life, and not everybody's cut out for it.
No, and you got to give yourself to it, right? And the hours and all that stuff. It's certainly a young person's game and all that kind of stuff. But it is a very interesting set of lessons one learns, though, right? I mean, you get to learn what clients are thinking, and the rational and more oftentimes irrational decision making that goes into stuff, and budgeting and all that kind of stuff. Strangely, you don't have a whole lot of control over a lot of the issues, aside from maybe getting the work done. It almost has a bit of a hollowness to it. This is my opinion. Maybe you agree. When you're not necessarily involved in the marketing that sort of brought it to be, or maybe the bigger decisions that were leading the marketing to go in that direction that you were then assigned to do as an agency, right? You feel almost like the last piece of the puzzle. Some people find that exciting, that collision of commerce and art, but yeah, it gets very frustrating when you realize you can only control so much in that food chain, and a lot of it being decided before you even get the brief.
Yeah, somebody asked me one time, what's it like to be in the agency business? And I said to him, I make the donuts. And what I meant by that is it's a pretty mundane role, and you just keep cranking out those donuts and hope somebody buys them. And in the end, I spent a number of years in the agency business, but when I left, I was so relieved. It was like the weight of the world had been taken off my shoulders, because I really got to the point where I realized that selling stuff isn't always the most important issue to me. It was really about creating things that I enjoyed most. And honestly, once you get promoted to management, you're not creating anything in the agency business. You're just managing people who do.
Well, there was a 1998 article about you in the Tribune here, and they called you a volunteer's volunteer at that time. And obviously, that's after we're going to get to the League One thing, I promise. But it does speak to, I think that article also spoke to, it didn't stop you from doing other things, right? If the day job wasn't doing it for you, although you had since left, right? You were very active in lots of different things, especially in and around Chicago. And I think that's kind of arguably that sort of whirling dervish of activity that kind of got you back into soccer now, didn't it?
That's true. Yeah, there's no question about it. But it was all of those diversions that kept me interested as well. I I really didn't like the business as much. And so I'd spend as little time as necessary there and dedicate myself to all those outside interests. At one point, it became a matter of friction within our agency. Our employees felt like I was committing way too much time to the outside interest and not enough time to the agency itself. And they actually brought it to my attention and said, "You're here all the time, but you don't seem as invested in us as you are in all those other things." And I said to them, "You're absolutely right. There's no question about it." And it was at that point I realized I needed to get out of the agency business.
Well, all right. How did you get involved with the organizing committee and the venue logistics for Chicago as this 1994 World Cup bidding was taking place in the late 1980s? Was this one of your various out of office activities? I got to think too that the fact that you were in the advertising community in Chicago, which is large, but it's certainly smaller than that of, say, New York. It's a little bit more, I guess, clubby and or rife with contacts and relationships built.
I was a coach. I coached women's soccer, and I was representing the Illinois Women's Soccer League at a meeting in Palatine. There was an indoor soccer facility in Palatine, and they held a meeting upstairs in the meeting room, and there were about 10 people up there representing different leagues from around Illinois. And they talked about the fact that we had a chance to bring the World Cup to Chicago if we put a great bid together. And I remember sitting in that room and saying, "We can do this." And they were like, "We don't know how to do that. How do we do that?" And I said, "Oh, I know how to do that." And they said, "Great, you're the chairman of the board." And so we formed the board and we created a bid process and we won a World Cup bid. And it was as simple as that. I just kind of fell into it. It wasn't my intention when we started out, but I'm just sitting at the meeting and somebody said, "Oh, the World Cup, we might have a chance at getting it." And I said, "How could we not have it in Chicago? I mean, it's a major city." And they were like, "No, we don't really know how to put that together." And I said, "Oh, let's see what we can do." And we were fairly successful at that. I think we had 5 games in the opening ceremonies.
Yes, very memorable. And there's obviously an ESPN 30 for 30 documentary about that taking place amidst a whole bunch of other things going on in sports that particular day, that opening game, including a certain slow speed car chase in Los Angeles with a certain.
That's right.
But I digress. Having watched all of that on split screen back in the day. So all right, so this is the late 80s, right? Maybe 87 or so when this was announced, and the U.S. got the was awarded the 94 tournament. But there was also a condition attached to this thing. Do you want to tell our audience what this condition was, why the U.S. also got this?
I'm not sure I remember that.
Well, the condition of having to start a professional league, no?
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
That's all right. No, that's okay.
Yeah, I'd completely forgotten that was a key aspect of it, that if we wanted the World Cup, we had to start a pro league. And it wasn't even on my mind at that time to be involved in that. I was strictly focused on trying to do the best job we could do in hosting World Cup games in Chicago. I wanted as many of them as we could get, and we got, I think that was the maximum that they would allow. And I was crazy. I wanted either the opening or the championship game. And I knew we couldn't have the championship game because Soldier Field wasn't big enough. And so I said, we're going to do everything we can, and we're going to get that opening game and as many games as they'll give us in addition to that. And that's how it worked. I was hell-bent on, let's make this great. And my motivation was really very simple. I'd been to World Cups before, a couple of them, and I loved it. And I had a little girl, a daughter, and I thought, I want her to see this too. And that was really what drove me. And people think that's, optimistic or however you want to describe it. I wanted her to be part of the game, and I wanted her to have a love of the game. And so I thought, I'm going to make this happen. And that's what we did. And I remember taking her to the first game, and she was maybe 5 at the time, something like that, maybe 6, I don't know. And we were sitting in the stands, and it was bright and sunny and very warm. And her mom is not a soccer lover, was sitting with us, and she couldn't wait to leave. But we sat there, the three of us, and I said to my daughter, honey, Daddy did all of this for you. That's it. That was my single motive. I just wanted my daughter to be exposed to the World Cup. And she turned to me and she said, Daddy, this is for me? I said, yep, it is. And she said, can we go home now? And that was it. We got up and left.
Oh, that's kind of a shot in the heart there. But that said, though, I think everybody, there's a lot of trepidation, right? Can the U.S. pull this off, and all the, Americanizing it, and FIFA, I'm sure, had its nerves jangling as well. But I got to tell you, what I think, once people saw that Chicago event, I mean, I thought it was sterling, right? And I think it really put everybody in a good, confident mood. And it was more than pulled it off, right? I think it was probably the best you could have done to start off an audacious and obviously financially outrageously successful World Cup. I think it's just a shame that Chicago's not going to be part of the next one. That's all.
Yeah, I was disappointed to hear they weren't. I think we did a great job with it. And at the time, I think it was financially the most successful World Cup they'd ever had.
No, it still is, I think, in terms of attendance and money generated and all that stuff. But let me ask you this, though. Okay, so as part of that bid process, right? So you're being brought back to the soccer thing. You're now also aware that, and history repeats itself. This sounds like the late 1960s if you go way back to the founding of the first professional leagues around, well, in essence, the modern day versions of. There were a couple of entities circling around the idea of starting this league. One was the APSL, which was essentially the only real outdoor pro league of any substance in the United States, which was a shell of what the NASL was years prior to that, right? This was charitably professional. I would call it semi-professional, but it still had some of the names of the teams and the leagues and stuff. And it was soldiering on. It was doing something, which is more than a lot of people were able to even think about in 1985, 86, when the league NASL just collapsed and went away and left everybody just depressed and not knowing what to do. And there was also this thing called, I think it was called at the time, Major League Professional Soccer, which obviously became MLS. And Alan Rothenberg, LA lawyer and famous guy back in the day, in the early days of the NASL with the Los Angeles franchise back then. But then there was also this other entity, and this was the entity that you helped put together. How about let's get into some of that. At what point did you decide or figure out or reason that, hey, maybe you would like to be part of going after this new league charter as well?
I feel like soccer had always been in my blood, and I was as interested in the stadiums as I was in the league itself. To me, I wanted to build those stadiums because I saw them as entertainment centers. That was, to me, the real draw. It wasn't just a soccer stadium, but around the exterior, we would have major entertainment that people could use 24/7. And that was the big deal to me, was let's build a dozen of these and let's see what happens. And yeah, we'll play soccer there once or twice a week and probably rent it out for other activities as well. But I was really more interested in what we could create in the kind of the retail side of that facility.
So you started from a real estate and or venue kind of perspective versus the sport and a league of play per se.
That's right. And that was an idea that I had tried to explore with John Petrosi in Rochester. We played at a thing called Aquinas Stadium that was owned by one of the Catholic high schools and had fallen in disrepair, and the city took it over and they renamed it Hollister Stadium. And we played our games there, and it was a dump. But I said, what we really need are better facilities. And that's what I was focused on, was how can we create an environment, and probably the league was necessary to do that, where we could build these better facilities. And that was my motive. We never got to that point, but that's what I was trying to do, is to figure out how to build facilities that people would actually use.
Besides soccer, give us an idea of what each of these 12, let's say, environments would look like besides a soccer field with stands. What else were you thinking about having in these environments?
We actually did extensive architectural drawings, and in those drawings, we on the outside of the stadium itself, there was ample parking and easy access. There are actually two different entrance and exit areas. One for the people who just wanted to come in and use the kind of retail environment that actually served as the base of the stadium, and another for the people who were going inside the stadium to enjoy an event. So I saw, as an example, Brunswick was a client of mine. I wanted to put their state-of-the-art bowling facility in this place as well. And they put so many bells and whistles. They modified bowling so much you wouldn't have recognized it. And it was great fun. They built a couple of test centers where they put it in themselves. And I thought, well, let's drop one of those in here. I wanted to have an indoor wave surfing facility where people could go and surf if they wanted to. There were about 10 of these different entertainment elements, if you will, that I wanted to put in the base of this stadium. And to me, that was the most exciting part of the whole deal. I'm a soccer guy and I love soccer and I wanted to have soccer played in the stadium. But I realized that using a stadium 10 or 12 times a year and maybe renting it out for high school football or something like that, that's not going to pay for that facility. The way you pay for that facility is to create some other day-to-day draw. And that's what I was hoping to create. We never got it off the ground. And I think we would have been successful. Mr. Pedrosi, who was not particularly enamored with all of that, gave me the green light and said, if you want to build it, go ahead. And that's what we were going to do. And unfortunately, he passed away before we were able to make that happen.
Well,
but
and I'm sorry, and I guess that's kind of one of the sort of untold lessons, really, of the NASL, right? People have to remember that this North American Soccer League thing was, like a lot of other fledgling leagues, a mere tenant, and maybe not well-treated tenant, of other people's facilities, either owned by another team, like, say, somebody from the NFL or Major League Baseball, or worse, getting third or fourth choice of dates and stuff, say, from a city that owned the facility or whatever, and cavernous usually at that, right? Not even suited well to the, shall we say, modest numbers of fans that would come to these games, say, for, say, the Cosmos, right?
Yeah, the first time I went to a Tampa Bay Rowdies game, I was stunned. You have this massive stadium, and I don't know how familiar with it, but it had
the big sombrero. Yeah, the Tampa Stadium.
Exactly. This really steep incline, if you will. And I couldn't believe that they were playing games in there, soccer games in there, because they couldn't draw flies. And it was comical to see this massive stadium and 1,000 people in it, 2,000 people in it, and spread out all over the place. That was one of the biggest problems with pro soccer, is that we didn't have adequate facilities. We had to use everybody else's, our big brothers' facilities, and they never fit.
So that said, right, and that we'll talk about how prescient sort of this idea was, right? Maybe certainly ahead of its time. But you had to have the soccer stuff though too, right? And tell us how the soccer component of this came together, because I did not know this until I sort of read a little bit more in detail. The blueprint for what the game was going to be in your package, in your offering, that wasn't necessarily your brainchild, but that of a colleague or so. How did that come about?
It was Dr. Jay Kessler from Washington, D.C. And his, I don't remember what his degree was in, but he taught at one of the universities in the Washington area. And he had read something about what I was trying to do and just cold called me and said, if I come to Chicago, will you meet with me? And I said, yes. And so we sat down and we talked, and he said, I've got this idea for this game. It's called Pro Zone Soccer. And he said, I really want to see it come to fruition. But he knew he didn't have long to live. He had cancer. And he said, I trust that you will take it somewhere special. And I didn't know the guy, but I said, let's see what we can do. So I started out thinking I was going to try to advance Pro Zone Soccer, which I thought was a pretty cool game. It involves some of the elements of soccer as we know it, but a lot of other things. It was bells and whistles and lights, and it was very cool. A lot of electronics, way ahead of its time. And I thought, let's give this a shot. We never did pull off Pro Zone Soccer. And unfortunately, he passed away shortly after that. But that's what really got me started on all of this. And I thought, well, let's see where we can take it. And the deeper I got into it, the more I realized that the soccer powers that be weren't going to deviate very far from the original game. They were still trying to promote soccer as it had always been known.
Well, we'll have a couple images on our website for folks trying to sort of follow along here, because there's a visual, especially in particular, of the field as envisioned. But I can best describe it pretty much as basically taking the team and having them sectioned off into either attacking or midfield or defender kinds of zones, if you will. And there's a restriction, if you will, for each of those types of players, where the offense can go only so far. It can go closest to the goal on the other side. The defenders can only go so close to the goal. But if a defender, for example, takes a shot from a long way away, they would be rewarded more handsomely for scoring from that distance, which is interesting because that's not necessarily a new concept, right? If you think about the 3-point shot in professional basketball, or you think what the NPSL did in the 1990s and early 2000s in the indoor game with the 2 and 3-point goals from further out of the arc and stuff. So in essence, it feels to me like in a nutshell, and obviously there's some more uniquenesses to it. And again, tell our audience to take a look online, but it does seem to me like there was this belief in the product, if you will, of this an Americanized increase of either scoring or play, maybe, if I dare say, taking a lesson or two from what had occurred in the indoor game, which was clearly its own interesting variation back in the 1980s.
I think you're right on. And when I was describing it in those days, I would say to people, the problem with soccer as we know it, traditional soccer, the problem with it in America is that it doesn't leave room for speculation. And American sports that are most successful are those where speculation exists. So baseball is an example. You ask yourself in the stands, is he going to throw him a curveball? Is he going to try to bunt? Is he going to try to steal second base? It's all that speculation that makes the game exciting. It's not just watching what they're doing. And the same is true for almost every other sport in the United States. And we thought that's what soccer lacks, is the ability to speculate. And now you can speculate that, okay, he's going to pass to the guy on the wing, but that's pretty straightforward. And so we were looking for other elements. What else could you do? And that's what the zones provided, is that there were limitations and opportunities. So as you sat in the stands, if you were paying attention, you could speculate as to what that individual's options really were. There aren't many other times in soccer that you can do that other than in what we know to be the traditional options. Okay, he's going to pass, or he's going to try to beat that guy, or whatever. This put a whole new level of speculation into the game. And I thought that had some merit. I obviously wasn't correct about that.
Well, there's also a whole bunch of other innovations here. And I when you read and see some of these, you also recognize that these also are, this is typically challenger kind of sport or challenger kind of league approach to stuff that, as we've learned over the years, is just time immemorial. So, for example, there was a component here of players in each zone essentially wearing different colored jerseys, right? Which obviously for fans that would make them more easily spottable, and to your point, can be, you can kind of assess or discern maybe what they might do, embedding that microchip in there so that a buzzer goes off, or, if they're, they go out of bounds, or they encroach on their zone and stuff, so that the fans can understand what's going on. But a lot of that, actually, that's an idea that sounds hauntingly familiar from the old dearly departed World Football League, where they had different colored pants and what for some of the players, so that the casual fan of football or the new fan of professional football could at least understand that, offensive linemen can only do so much, and those different colored pants and stuff was an idea to kind of help the beginner or the novice better understand what the hell's going on out there. And soccer, right, is also had this how can I describe it, this legacy foreign, quote unquote, component to it, right? Which, if you're going to Americanize something, sadly, you have to dumb it down a bit so people kind of know what the hell's going on, because it becomes a sophisticated game despite it being, as Pele once said, the simplest game.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's what we were trying to accomplish, is to make it accessible to everyone. There were just so many people that couldn't follow a soccer game. I remember taking people to games who have never been to a soccer game before, and they were baffled. They just couldn't figure out what was really going on. They have a tendency to follow the ball. And, anyone who's ever played the game will tell you the person who's got the ball is the least important person on the field at that moment. It's the person who's about to get the ball that matters. And if you can't predict that, you don't really enjoy the sport as much. So to me, that's what we were trying to accomplish, is to give people a better sense of anticipation and a better understanding of what was going on out there, other than just follow the ball.
All right, what's this? Oldschoolshirts.com. Fantastic. You've heard me talk on and on and on about the great folks and the great wares at oldschoolshirts.com. Like the name implies, it's old school and it's shirts, and they put them together, into what they call oldschoolshirts.com. It's like the name implies, but of course we love them primarily for their sportswear. You name the league of the past, you name the team of the past, the chances are huge that they're going to have more than one shirt and different color schemes for things that you may remember from the United Football League or the Major Indoor Soccer League, or various flavors of the original XFLs, plural, or the Federal League perhaps, or maybe World Team Tennis, or maybe it was the North American Soccer League, and on and on and on. But hey, it's not just sports. It's also great cultural touchstones and memories from the past. How about the officially licensed Evel Knievel connection? How about collection? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. Various colleges. How about dead malls of the past? Ice cream parlors, maybe even radio stations that you might remember. Hey, even there's a latest edition of the now old, Aloha Stadium commemorative shirt. All that kind of stuff and more. You will find at least a handful of shirts that you will just transport you back into your past, and you will amaze and impress your friends at the same time. It's oldschoolshirts.com, and we got a promo code for you, of course. Let's save you some dough while you go there, and its promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats, that's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Hey, P.F. Wilson and your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, thank you for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. I also think, too, there's a little bit of guilt, right, from the old NASL experience. And now I'm going to project on you, but you can argue against me for this. But, I mean, you have to also remember, too, as I'm sure you remember from your Lancers days, there was this constant debate and or furtiveness, I guess, or uncomfortability, if you will, with the full-fledged international game as it was trying to be played and marketed in the United States, right? The idea of tiebreakers and ultimately this thing called a shootout from 35 yards out, which was, I think, exciting and arguably should come back today, given all the dour 0-0 games that we see in Europe. The idea of having a certain amount of players from the United States at all times on the field. 3, I think, ultimately becoming 4. The idea of a 35-yard line, right, to allow for forwards to be a little bit more close to the goal and maybe increase the scoring action, and even the scoring system, right? The idea of being rewarded even if you're down to at least get a point for a goal up to 3 goals that you score. Those were all looked upon as heresy by the traditionalists, and obviously FIFA. I think some people say, like our friend Paul Gardner and some others we've had on the show, would argue that some of the reasons that maybe the sport sort of fell out of favor as the 80s sort of dawned was this regression to the FIFA mandate to go back to the old rules and not the Americanized things. I guess what I'm trying to say in there is that even soccer too in the United States, and the indoor version as well, was trying to quote unquote Americanize it a bit more to make it more palatable and maybe more of a product that could be more sustainable.
Yeah, I was quoted many times in pointing out to people that Americans like scoring. And there weren't a whole lot of Americans in those early days that would enjoy a 1-0 game. It wasn't going to happen. You and I, as soccer people, might say, "Oh, that was a very exciting game," and they would say, "Wait, there wasn't any scoring. What was exciting about that?" So we had to figure out ways to bring a little bit more opportunity to score into the game, without, in my opinion, without destroying the essence of the game. I think the game was still the game. We just added some nuances to it that we hoped would improve the scoring and hold the attention of the spectator. I did a lot of research in that area, particularly in Washington, D.C. with Jay Kessler. We did a number of sessions where we put people in the stands, up to 200 people at a time, and asked them to watch the regular game and to watch our game, and ask them to take notes on what their impressions were. And there wasn't a person in the stadium that didn't understand our concept within the first 15 or 20 minutes. Every single person, they had to write down there's a big clock in the stadium, and they had to write down at what minute they understood what was happening, because they were given no information before the game started. They weren't told what the rules were. They weren't told how anything was played. They were just told, watch the game and let us know when you understand it. No one ever exceeded 20 minutes before they fully understood what was going on out there. We thought that had merit, and we wanted to pursue that aspect of it, is that you can bring people into the game, because it required all the same skills. There was nothing in our game that you wouldn't find in a regular game, other than some of those strange nuances that we added. But the essence of the game remained the same, and that's what we were hoping people would appreciate. We were vilified, as I think you probably know.
Well, okay, so take us into sort of the bidding process and how you're socializing all of this stuff, right? Because I think if you look backward at this, right, I'm fascinated by when and how the fusion of these two ideas comes together, right? Because what you described earlier on, right, which is the idea of soccer specificness, real estate in and around activities that could sort of ensure sort of a year-round kind of revenue flow, and the soccer thing was kind of a, maybe a shining star of that, maybe as the hub of that. But then there's the actual rules evolution, shall we say, to making the actual on-field product more attractive and more Americanized. I guess what I'm trying to get into is describe to us what the process was to not only do the bidding part of it, but to socialize these two very radical ideas that by themselves probably were hard for the traditionalists to swallow, let alone having them both together.
Well, I start from the premise that I didn't believe that the traditionalist was a large enough audience to sustain the sport in this country at that time. I felt we had to appeal to the uninformed, the novice, to the person who's never played the game. Because one of the things that struck me is that if you really wanted to enjoy a soccer game in the United States at that time, you had to have been a player. because you sit in the stands silently with your friends and you watch the game progress and you think in terms of what you would do or what your teammates would do. But you didn't really have to spend a lot of energy explaining it to people. I loved going to games with friends who were in the soccer community because we never talked. We just sat there and watched the game, which is a very different aspect of speculating, if you will. A spectator sport in football and baseball, if you're going to go to those games, you spend a lot of time talking to the people you came with about, oh, damn, I thought he was going to pick him off. Oh, yeah, he stole second base, that kind of stuff. You don't see that in soccer to the same extent. And that's what I wanted to advance was let's figure out how we can keep this game as pure as possible, but at the same time, appeal more to the American spectator.
Yeah, so it's broadening it and maybe making it more attractive to more the casual fan, so to speak, which by extension, in theory, should grow the marketplace. And I guess that's probably what the allure would have been, or a big part of your pitch, right, to FIFA and to the entities in and around the World Cup and stuff, right? If you want to have a legacy, how about a sport that's not, and probably, let me guess too, probably also fear, right? Fear of what happened to the NASL back in the 80s, right? Because I think a lot of people were, they saw the World Cup as a chance to reboot, but holy cow, I mean, it's like nobody wanted to go back into the dark ages. And I think actually now we still see it today in terms of how MLS does or doesn't embrace some of the old teams and names and even the existence of the NASL because it was so catastrophically, I mean, had its moments, trust me, right? But it was such a disaster by 1985. People didn't want to even remember that happened.
You are right on. It was that fear that permeated everything. It's like we're doing all this work to bring a World Cup to the United States, and what will we have in its place when it's gone? Are we just going to have another NASL? That wasn't acceptable. So we had to think in terms of what would make this more acceptable to the American spectator, and how can we ensure that those big audiences we knew we would attract for the World Cup would still be interested in soccer after it left. And I kept, every meeting I attended, I kept saying to them, don't forget the Olympics. And people would cringe. And I would say to them, every 4 years, people get excited about the Olympics. And then the day it's over, they forget about them. And we don't want to be that sport. And that's how I viewed soccer. When there was something significant going on, people paid attention. And then boom, you couldn't draw flies in the regular season. That was my problem. How do we overcome that? And I thought it took a combination of factors. You had to make the game more interesting. You had to change a lot of the dynamics of the environment, if you will. That's why we went to those the zone game, because now you could really speculate, something that a lot of people couldn't do in a regular soccer game. They can't say, oh, I think he should pass here, or I think he's going to make a run over here. You and I can do that because we were in the game. We can look at it and say, okay, this guy needs to make a run. And when he does, he's going to get a ball. We can appreciate that, but the average spectator isn't watching a game that way. They're watching the ball. That's all they see for the most part. And they can cheer when they see a spectacular play. But other than that, they're not really watching the game, not like we would.
All right, so we're in 1993-ish or so, a year before the actual World Cup. What do you remember of the process of either bidding, presenting, selling these concepts, and to whom and how received by them?
Well, I don't frankly remember the people all that much, but I remember the reception, and it was pretty cold. We were not well received. And I'll take responsibility for that. I obviously didn't package it properly, didn't present it correctly. I went in there with guns blazing, thinking people are going to have to respect the fact that we've come up with something new and original, and they didn't. They resented it, actually.
Well, who's they? Is this the U.S. Soccer Federation? Is this FIFA? Is this other entities?
Well, I went to visit FIFA before I presented it to the Federation. And the people there, Guido Tignoni and Seth Blotter and all those folks, they were very receptive. And they said, yeah, absolutely, make this happen. And oh, by the way, we had a separate meeting. I was only going to stay there for a day and a half. I stayed an extra day because they wanted to talk about introducing it in Europe. They liked the concept of what we were doing so much. They said, get the US up and running, and then we want you to come over and do this in Europe. And so we spent a second day just talking about that. However, when I got back to the States, the first thing I read was that they were lukewarm about anything I had to offer at best. And I had been told by Guido Tagnoni, their PR person, we're not going to give you a public endorsement. That's not going to happen. And we don't want you to say anything about our meeting. Don't talk about it at all with anybody, because if you do, I guarantee you we will withdraw any support that might be forthcoming. And so I couldn't even tell people how successful the meetings went. And they were very, very successful conversations. But in the end, I knew that we were on our own. There was no question about it. I got off the plane coming back from there, and I got a call from a reporter at the USA Today. And I didn't even know he knew I went, but somehow somebody tipped him off, and I suspect it was Guido Tagnoni. And he said, tell us how it went. And I told him I can't do that. I'm a private citizen in a private business deal that I have nothing to talk about at this time. And, the next day there was a small blurb in USA Today about the fact that we'd pitched our idea to FIFA. And there was a couple of quotes in there from Guido Tagnoni, because he had been the one who tipped off the reporter. So I knew that every time I thought we had an ally, I'd learned that they probably weren't. And that was very real. The allegiances to the traditional game run very, very deep. And it was very hard to break through that.
Well, you may also, again, remember from your NASL days, right? The butting of heads when it came to some of those rules we talked about before between FIFA and the NASL trying to kind of Americanize stuff. I also have to think that. So here's the question. Let me just ask the question. Did the U.S. Soccer Federation, as it was known back then, did they know that you were there at FIFA? Because if they didn't, I'm sure they were probably not happy and probably scared witless that you would possibly be in a position to ruffle feathers in this thing that, with the World Cup coming the next year.
Yeah, they knew I was there. They weren't happy about it. And they thought it was a fool's mission. They expected FIFA to boot me out on my butt. And they were pretty angry that didn't happen. FIFA actually was fairly non-committal in a sense. They tried to be very neutral. In fact, Tagnoni gave a statement to that effect, that they weren't taking sides in it or something like that, that, the best idea would survive, however he phrased it. And U.S. Soccer wasn't happy about that. They really wanted a full-blown endorsement of what they were doing, and they wanted us to be criticized, and it didn't happen that way. And all that time, I was still keeping conversations with people at U.S. Soccer. I met with Rothenberg a couple of times. He came to my office a couple of times. I met with Sunil Gulati. Gulati hated my guts. Literally sat in my conference room one day and banged on the conference table. He's a diminutive person, so he likes to be very demonstrative, if you will. And he's banging on my conference table, leaning over it in my face, and basically saying, you know what, we're going to bury you figuratively and literally. And I remember those words. He was just seething. And my accountant was in the room at the time, and he kind of pushed Sunil back, like, what do you think you're doing? And pushed him back into his seat. And then it was all orchestrated. At that point, Rothenberg turns to Sunil and says, okay, you need to leave. And Sunil storms out of the meeting and leaves the building altogether. It was so obvious that they had orchestrated that. There was going to be a good cop and a bad cop. And so after Sunil leaves, then Alan says, okay, look, let's work this out. Let's be partners. We can make this work together. You've got some good ideas. We've got some ideas. Here's what we want. We want you to build and operate the stadiums, handle all of the operations side of it, and we'll provide the soccer. And I just kind of laughed and said, my investors won't let me do that. We have to play our game. And he left. That was the end of it. We never talked again.
So that leads me to that says so fascinating. Do you ever think in retrospect that the decoupling the soccer part of it from the development part of it might have saved it? Not necessarily partnering or giving in, if you will, to Rothenberg and friends. Because if there's any, I mean, look, you know this better than anybody, right? The idea of the soccer specific stadium, right, has really, God bless Lamar Hunt back in the late 90s for building the first one, and now look at it. But it's an idea, frankly, and the multi-purpose use of the real estate around these things is a much bigger idea now. I thank you to the Atlanta Braves with their Battery Park, and every sports franchise now seems to go out of their way or wants to. If they're building a stadium, it's not just a stadium; it's everything else in and around it to extend the revenues and diversify and making it more of a full-fledged entertainment thing. I got to the question in there. I got to think you have to feel some level of validation having delivered this idea back in the day, yet maybe wonder that if the dramatic changes to the game itself had not been part of it, that maybe it would have gotten a little bit more buy-in and or acceptance.
Yeah, I'm not one of those what if kind of guys, but if John Petrosi had lived, we would have built that prototype, and we had the plans done. We had the property, we owned the land there. Everything was good to go. All we had to do was tear down the old high school stadium, Aquinas Stadium, and we would have built this prototype. And unfortunately, he passed away before we were able to pull that off. So I felt like we were ahead of the curve. I really felt like we were onto something that I hadn't seen anybody else do yet. And I really believe that if you want that property to make sense, you can't just build this great big monster of a stadium and expect it to sit there and pay for itself when you're only using it a couple of times a week, if that. I felt like we had to make the property itself a draw, do something so that people were here on a regular basis, on a daily basis, if you could. And that's what I was more interested in that, to be honest with you, than I was the soccer itself. I thought building that facility was the most important part of the equation. And we obviously weren't successful in any of that. But I do take a measure of satisfaction in knowing that we had a really valid concept way before a lot of other people were actually able to execute it.
So Rothenberg, right? He's a lawyer by trade, right? He was very active with Jack Cook back in the day in the '60s, I think, when the first initial sort of pro attempts were made in the modern day. I guess I'm really curious as to what was pushing. And he was also the president of the federation, I believe, at the time, too, which, conflict and or concentration of power. And Lord knows U.S. soccer has always had those issues. But I guess to the outsider, right, not many people sort of have recognized sort of the history of the governing body of soccer worldwide in FIFA, and then how FIFA doles that out to national federations such as the U.S. Soccer Federation. I'm trying to figure out what set them off so hostily to you. Obviously they're threatened. Do you think it was because you were coming up with this, with some ideas that actually did resonate, right? To your credit, that would upset this, I guess, apple cart that had been set in motion in the late 80s with the World Cup, and they didn't want to see anything, any variance, any wind of upset in the midst of this big event that was coming up in 94. It just seems to me like defensiveness almost was sort of the bile underneath all of this.
I think you're on the right track there. Their intent was always to start their own pro league on the heels of the World Cup, and I represented a impediment to that. They didn't like that, and one of the things that I hadn't anticipated that they found most disturbing was the fact that I had a stadium plan and they didn't. They were going to be forced to go into existing facilities, none of which were adequate. There was no, purely soccer facility at that time. They were using everybody else's facilities. And that was the biggest rub to them. And I had that conversation with a couple of their people where they were like, just build the stadiums. We'll be your tenant. And I was like, no, I really want the other side of the equation as well. And I needed that because to build the stadiums, I had to have money from some major sponsors. And to get the sponsors involved, I needed the soccer piece. We had deals pending with some major corporations that would put their names on each of these stadiums. And to do that, they knew they needed to have identity on a uniform as well. So it was kind of an all or nothing package at that point. And we had done a lot of homework in that area. That's my background is in marketing. So I knew who to call at these companies and how to get them on board. They weren't that far along. They were still just trying to sell the love of the game. They didn't have the same focus on the sponsors and the commercial side of it. They were just thinking in terms of filling seats.
So I'm surprised at the end of the day. So how did it finally play out then? I mean, did you make like each individual bids? Like you get like 2 hours and then you sit in the hallway while everybody else does their thing? Like how does it sort of play out, or does it happen in more incoherent chunks and intrigue that maybe you learn through the grapevine how things are going?
No, you just summarized it in that first part. We went in, made our pitch. I don't remember if we had an hour or 2 hours, whatever we had. And it was, just a little circus. You go in, you show them your stuff. And each team had an opportunity to present. And, as one team was exiting, the other one was entering. And I think there were 3 of us that made pitches. I'm trying to remember Bill's last name, the dentist out of California. Had been with the old American Professional Soccer League. He also made a pitch. And he came to me before the presentations, a couple of weeks before that, and wanted to merge our efforts. And there wasn't anything on his that I found of value. So I just declined and said, no, we're going to go in on our own. And that forced him to go in on his own. And I remember when it was over, they were talking to a couple of the folks at the federation, and they just trashed me. They were like, "Oh no, his plan was awful. We never seriously considered it. There's nothing in it of any merit." I mean, they couldn't wait to set that thing on fire. And yet, if you look closely at what Major League Soccer eventually did, they revised their original plan and adopted many of the elements that came out of my plan.
That was going to be my next question. Is like, how much was stolen from your idea?
I don't remember the particulars, but at the time we literally put the plans side by side and probably found 20 or 25 similarities that hadn't been in their original plan, but were now in it that were similar to my plan. So yeah, they borrowed heavily from it. I'm trying to remember the guy's name, Mark Abbott. I think that was his name.
Sure. He went on to MLS fame. Yes.
Yeah. So he was responsible for putting their bid together. And somebody leaked ours to him from the group. They gave it to him, and he just, basically cut and paste whole sections out of ours back into his plan. The plan they originally came in with was not the plan they finally submitted. They changed it to reflect a lot of the positive things that we had put in our plan.
Well, and again, too, you got to think about too again, Rothenberg is head of he's the head of the federation, but he's also sort of the lead guy behind the Major League Soccer bid. The irony, of course, being that the APSL at the time was the only league that was actually in existence. You guys and Rothenberg's crew, but he's like judge and jury, right? And
we saw that conflict of interest, and we brought that up, and they just told us that's the way it is, that he's going to sit in both seats. And we knew then that we didn't have a chance. That we went into the presentation knowing we did not have a chance. But we felt at that point we owed it to our investors and to the people who put the effort in to go ahead and make the presentation. But literally walking in, we knew we were dead meat.
Well, how about the APSL? How did you feel about them, especially when you guys were maybe talking about maybe kind of joining forces and stuff there too? Did you know, and or did you think they knew that they were also dead meat too?
I never talked seriously with them about joining forces. They asked me a couple times to do it, but I wasn't interested. I didn't think they had anything of value in there. It was the most vanilla, the most traditional of plans. And frankly, it felt very much like a minor league plan, not a major league plan.
Well, which is exactly what it was. It was Division II at the time, and to its credit, the only thing soldiering on. But to your point, right? No, lacking imagination, the facilities issue, all that stuff, right?
Yeah, I think it was just, I don't know how to say this politely, but it was the reserve team wanting to play on the big team. And that was how they approached it. You could feel it. They just wanted to be among the big boys. And there wasn't anything in their plan that suggested that they were capable of playing at that level. It was business as usual. They basically dusted off what they'd always done and thought that they could make it fly in a major pro league. And we all kind of knew that wasn't going to happen. Their focus to some degree was, well, we'll attract higher quality players. Okay, well, that's good, but that doesn't solve all the other problems. You have to attract some major sponsors. You have to be in the highest level facilities. You have to have major broadcast rights that you don't have, and I don't see you getting. So we didn't really consider them to be a competitor. We knew that Rothenberg and his crew, they held all the aces. And if we were going to beat anybody, they were the ones we had to get past.
So looking back then from all of this, right? I mean, the intrigue and the politics, right, of international and national soccer, which is a tough stream to swim against. Plus the knowledge of these ideas about soccer specific stadium and understanding the game, maybe needing a bit of a tweak or two. Some of these things though have truly become standard issue these days. And I guess I'm curious as to if you had to do it all over again, would you? And number two, how do you think it's played out since then? Would you, do you think things could have been different? Or do you think it was just kind of all in the stars and fait accompli?
Would I do it all over again? Yeah, it was fun to do, even losing, I have to say, or having lost, I can say that it was fun in the pursuit. And I enjoyed that. And I enjoyed the fact that every time we turned around, it seemed like our group was coming up with another innovative wrinkle. And I think that impacted the sport directly. I think you see elements of that today to some degree. And what I mean by that is it forced the powers that be and those people who came into power to recognize that they couldn't do it the way it had always been done, that they'd have to do something different because the American soccer fan was somewhat different. They weren't just the traditionalist. The ethnic community that built the game in this country and to whom we owe so much, they were no longer the majority. The majority were now 14-year-old kids, boys and girls, and their parents. And the challenge there, and I said this often, I actually said this to the Chicago White Sox when I went to watch a soccer game, a Sting game at Old Comiskey. The sound system, it was awful. So no matter what the announcer was saying, all you heard was, you couldn't make out a word. And I said, if you want this game to catch on, you need to fix that sound system. I had dinner with the owner of the Sting that night. And I said to him, you know what, if you had $50,000, he said to me, if I gave you $50,000, what would you do with it? And I said, I'd buy a new sound system. I said, and he was like, what? I said, yeah, you've got dads in the audience who don't know anything about soccer. They've got kids who play. And so they bring them to a pro game and they sit there like idiots because their kids say, Dad, what just happened? What did the announcer say? And they didn't hear it. They don't know the game themselves, so they couldn't respond. and they feel like idiots and they don't want to come back again because they don't want to be embarrassed in front of their own kid. So we have to solve some of those fundamental issues and bring the sport into the 20th century. I thought that was the biggest challenge we faced, and our version of it as well is don't just present the game as it was always presented. Find a way to bring in a new audience. I felt like women were underrepresented in the audience, and we needed to find things to bring them in. And I remember being at a press conference with Lee Stern and the Chicago Sting. He was introducing new sponsors, and I was overseeing the McDonald's business at the time. We were one of the sponsors. And Lee gets up, and the first thing he says is, "I'm so pleased to see so many women at this cocktail party tonight. You have to admit that we are starting to attract women because they love looking at these guys in these cool shorts." And I thought I was going to fall off my chair. It's like, no, they're coming to watch the soccer, not to ogle men. And I feel like it took us a long time to get out of that kind of mentality about the sport. The sport has its own merit, and it has its audience. And today you've got entire generations, 3 generations now, who have played the game in this country, who know it well, and aren't going to be sold on simple facts anymore. Now they need to see a quality product put out on the field, and it has to be a quality environment. So you can't host a pro game in a high school or a college stadium anymore. You've got to put it in a truly professional setting. And I feel like we contributed to that. I felt like we forced people to recognize that the game had to move up a little bit. And I could be wrong about that. Maybe I'm, giving us way too much credit, but I felt like we forced people to think somewhat differently about how to present the game.
Well, no, and you look at internationalization since then too, right? I mean, people know what the highest quality of the sport is worldwide now, right? And now the U.S. kind of has to, align itself and catch up and if you will, beat it at its own game. But let me ask you this question though, because it's sort of latent in all of our conversation. What did you think of the indoor game when it burst on the scene in the late 70s, early 80s, and to many people's opinion, helped accelerate the decline of the outdoor game, along with the reversion to the FIFA rules and the more staid approach to soccer, despite the NASL's early attempts? Could someone argue that that a bunch of the rules that you were sort of propagating were almost like taking some of the, I don't know, the more the excitement, I guess, or the higher scoring of indoor and bringing it to the outdoor game, right? How much either front of mind or back of mind was indoor soccer in all of this process, or did you not even sort of think about that?
Somebody asked me that question years ago, and I said to them, in my mind, indoor soccer is the equivalent of softball to baseball. They're not the same game. Anyone who's played softball knows it's not the same as baseball. And I believe that indoor soccer has very little in common with outdoor soccer. It requires some of the same skills, but not all of the same skills. And you play it very, very differently. And so I think it's fun to watch some indoor soccer. I wasn't as big a fan of it as I am the outdoor game, because I think indoor soccer is like pinball. You're just going to watch it bounce around and hope that it hits the right pod each time. Pods being those players. It has its own merit. I like some indoor soccer. You don't see it being played in this country at the highest level, though. And that's one of my problems, is that the very best players are still playing outdoor. And for whatever reason, indoor hasn't been able to break through. But I think that's because American spectators have a threshold, and they also have a limit. There are just so many indoor games they can watch in the season. So you're not going to play indoor soccer in the summer. You're going to play it in the winter, and you're going to have to be up against ice hockey, and you're going to have to be up against the NBA, and you're going to have to be up against WNBA. That's not going to fly anymore. I mean, they missed that opportunity to build an audience, and I don't think I don't think they're going to have an opportunity to do that again anytime soon. And the other piece of it is, you've got to have people who play the game who are willing to come to watch the game. And I don't know that many people who play indoor soccer that are willing to buy tickets to watch it.
Well, let's cul-de-sac this then, and maybe sort of branch out into the overall state of soccer in this country and maybe globally too. Um, Given what you've been through, given that sort of pioneering stuff that has borne some fruit, arguably earlier than most people maybe were ready for it. What is your take on Major League Soccer, for example, and USL and these soccer specific stadiums that are seemingly multiplying and borrowing from many of the different sort of entertainment / complex facility kinds of dynamics that you posed to the Federation back in the 90s. Do you think the state of soccer is in a good place? What do you think of Major League Soccer after all these years? Do you even still follow the game or care about the game after this amazing yet oft forgotten series of events?
Well, I love the game, and I think I probably always will. I have to admit, I do not follow Major League Soccer, and that's just born out of my ill-placed bitterness.
Still, after all these years, huh?
Yeah, I can't do it. I just can't do it. So I'm not a fan. I did go to a number of the Chicago Fire games when I lived in Chicago, by a handful of them. And I didn't spend any time watching the game. I was up in the sky boxes there, or whatever they call their luxury boxes, and I was having fun with friends. Typically the people I know would take 3-4 boxes in a row, and so you could move from box to box and see all kinds of different people. And we would laugh about it because the game would be over and we'd still be partying, and people were like, "Oh, I guess we have to leave," because nobody even knew what the score was. It wasn't unique to just Major League Soccer. We kind of did that in the women's game too. I went to a game recently back there, the women's league that I was very active in for many, many years celebrated its 50th anniversary, and they had the reception there, and there was a women's game scheduled at the same time. So we went to the box and watched the game. I don't think any of us watched 5 minutes of the game. We were busy, getting caught up socially and having fun and all the rest of that. And that, unfortunately, is the way I have viewed Chicago soccer. I haven't really watched a lot of the pro soccer when I was there. I went to a few games at Comiskey in the old days when the Sting played there, and frankly, I enjoyed that. But once Major League Soccer came around, I guess you could say, if truth be told, I was pretty turned off by it.
Yeah, and as a longtime fan of the game myself, right? I have my hot and cold feelings about it too. Now living in Chicago, I mean, it's certainly no New York Cosmos from back in the day when I was a kid, right? And Chicago is, the Fire have been just horrid over the last almost decade now, and it was what an exciting time when they were, 1998, and they took the league by storm and won it all, and they won the double with the U.S. Open Cup, and they haven't really won anything since, which is a shame because this is a great sports town, but they're not going to. It's been a tough ride here, even going back to Soldier Field, which ironically, right, is exactly what we've spent the last hour and a half talking about, right? Is being a renter, if you will, in a big cavernous stadium that has to be, just ignored, so to speak, with all the empty seats in there, right? So in some respects, you haven't sort of gotten in past the big issues that we talked about back from the 1970s. So that's a saddening thing. But I would say this, though, it is really interesting having heard this story and talking to you to hear more of the flavor of it. It is amazing to me how much they have borrowed from that page or two of your binder when it comes to building the stadium first, right? I mean, to the point where I think most soccer purists, right, who would have arguably been part of that MLS early days, behind making that happen, the traditional game, all that stuff, I think actually kind of cringe when it's about building the stadium first and then the soccer, right? So in a perverse way, Major League Soccer over 26 years or so, right, has gone from the alignment with FIFA and the purity of the game and begrudgingly sort of gotten to the soccer specific stadium and stuff, where it's now that's the first thing. So in some respects, it's kind of just a casualty of today's economics, but it also goes back to the idea that you had in the very first place, right? Soccer is not unimportant. The product is not unimportant, but the place and the manner and the environment in which it's presented and enjoyed and marketed to is now supremely, almost primarily important. Now, some will argue whether that's a good thing for the sport of soccer, the financial underpinnings, I guess, but the soccer purists kind of worry about that. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the old expression, experience is everything. And not everybody understood that in the early days of Major League Soccer. You had to create a memorable experience. And one of my favorite lines, I handled marketing for a lot of fast food companies over the years, and McDonald's was among them. And I used to say at the meetings to the franchisees, people go where people are. So make sure that people are. And they didn't always understand that. But if you can attract a significant core audience, other people will follow. They're sometimes recruited by that core audience, but sometimes they just think, well, if other people are going there, I need to go there. And I don't know that they've always understood that in soccer, that we have to create an experience for people that goes beyond the sport itself. And I don't mean we got to have all kinds of promotional stuff and fireworks. There are other ways to create experiences. And I think it's how you get the fans to interact with each other that is the most important piece of the puzzle. And that's a complex issue. You can't just put them down in the seats and hope that they're going to respect and enjoy each other. But that to me is the piece that makes spectator sports most important, is how do the spectators interact with each other, not just how do they watch whatever's going on the field, whether it's a baseball game or any other sport. I started in pro baseball, and I would sit in the stands and I would listen to the fans talk to each other, and they were seldom talking just about the play that happened. They were often talking about how they interpreted it. What would they have done differently? Or what did they do when they played in their little league team? How did they run the play? That's that kind of experiential relationship is what makes spectator sports so important. And we don't always grasp that. Sometimes we focus on, are there enough TV sets tuned in?
Yeah, it's engagement, right? And that engagement can be at the park. It could be watching on television. That could be at an event that supports in between those two extremes, or can spill over into other activities that are related to the club, shall we say, maybe for the facilities that are nearby during the off season and all those kinds of things. That feels it's experiential. I guess that's the word, coming back to my marketing agency days. And I think that's kind of at the heart of what this original idea was all about in the first place.
I think you're right. And, before we go any further, I've got to thank you, because you've stirred up a lot of old memories that I hadn't had in a long time. And it's been kind of fun to reminisce about all of those aspects. And particularly, it drove me back to thinking about my days with the Lancers, which were really formative for me. It was that was really where I think I gained so much. I can't say enough about having worked for John Petrosi. He was a curmudgeon and could be a very difficult guy, but he was a gift for me. He really helped me sort things out. And when I left there, I went to work for an agency, and the first boss I had at the agency was the other end of the spectrum. He was slick and polished, and equally as important in helping me determine who I was going to be as a professional. So between those two guys, I became the end product. But John Petrosi, I think if he were alive, he would tell you he didn't realize he had that kind of an impact on me, but he really did. And I admired him and would have done anything for him, and was grateful to him for every opportunity he gave me. And there was a time when I couldn't even afford a car, and the beater that I had got run into by somebody else and totaled. And he said, "Go out and buy another car." And I said, "I don't have any money." And he handed me $2,500 and said, "Go buy a car," and didn't ask for the money to be repaid. It was just one of those things where, if you had a surrogate father, he would have been mine.
Well, and to give you all the confidence and the chutzpah, right, to put together a concept like this and take on the establishment and frankly, just in your overall career. So this really, to me, the thanks go to you, really, because this is a really interesting story that soccer aficionados, sports junkies, just anybody who's interested in the history and the evolution of sports, and especially soccer in this country. This isn't a divot. This to me feels like is an important part of the dynamic of the history of the sport in this country, right? People have to remember what was going on at the time, and some of the things that you put out there were, frankly, are just taken for granted these days, and that's, again, it may be small solace here, but you should take some great comfort in knowing that. Albeit a bit ahead of its time, a lot of this concept really took hold and was on the right path. And that doesn't fill the bank account, but it might make you feel a little warm and fuzzy and comforted as you go through the rest of your career and your life. So to me, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm really glad you went out of your way to give us some time to talk about it. I can't wait to share it.
I'm grateful to you for asking me to do it. I thought that all of that was long forgotten. But one of my favorite experiences was when I was getting all this off the ground. I got interviewed by The Guardian in London, and my daughter was living there at the time, and it was the cutest thing. She called me up and she said, "Daddy, why are you in the newspaper today?" And I said, they want to talk soccer. And the question is, will they want to talk to me in a year? And they did. But as I said to her, I'm not sure that we're going to have the staying power we need because we're fighting some pretty big obstacles. There were some big players that, we didn't have all the resources and we didn't have the influence. And I think the influence was more important than the resources, to be honest with you. We were pretty much, to this day, I am still very much despised in the higher ranks of U.S. soccer. And I've heard that. I mean, I still go to soccer functions, Soccer X and other gatherings, conventions, and things like that. And I get a very, very frosty reception from U.S. soccer people.
See, and I think that's ignorance of history, because you're in the moment, you're in the moment of the time, and to recognize that, if it bent the force a little bit, right, against the controlling forces, right. Think about, right, the things that have come from it, right, the ideas that have been, shall we say, liberally borrowed from what you put out there. Sure. Okay. Maybe we can argue about Prozone and the complexities of it and all that kind of stuff. And to the international soccer community, I could see easily noses being turned up, but you cannot deny some of not only the innovations there, which have actually filtered their way through the sport and continue to do so, because Lord knows it could be pretty boring at times still, the game. But there's no denying the idea of facility and experiential and all that stuff. Like I said before, I mean, MLS is leading with that now, not the game.
As it should be. And, I do take some satisfaction in knowing that they did borrow some elements from what we introduced. But as Ray Kroc once said to me, everybody's got ideas. Ideas are a dime a dozen. And so a lot of the ideas that we try to incorporate, I don't really feel like we deserve a whole lot of credit, because, as Ray also said, It's the person who executes that gets the credit. And we weren't good at that. I take full responsibility for that. I wasn't the right person to lead this effort. I often think that if there was a different leader, League One America and Pro Zone Soccer would have taken off. I don't think they were bad ideas. I just don't think they were led by the right person.
Okay, many thanks to Jim. Fantastic. This is what this show is all about. And, the proverbial phrase, I learned a lot. Well, that you can square that phrase for this conversation. And hopefully you learned and enjoyed this story, this journey of League One America as much as I did. You can find out more about Jim's marketing and advertising offerings at his company website. It is called Brands That Stand. That's brands, it's plural, brands, that stand, brandsthatstand.com. And you can follow us and for more information about this show at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Of course, you can check out all of our episodes on the website. We post them all there for you. And of course, if you want to get every latest episode and be the first on your block to get every time we release a show, you should be subscribing or following us wherever you get podcasts. A couple of 5-star reviews where you can too. Wink, wink. We wouldn't mind that either. You can send us email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. While you're on the website, check out our merch section. Why don't you? Some cool offerings around defunct and forgotten teams and leagues and stuff from our pals at TeePublic, our friends at royalretros.com, oldschoolshirts.com, some other things too. And we appreciate that. We get some referral shekels of love when you purchase an item or two or 7 from that. And we thank you kindly for the consideration and or the purchases there. Our thanks, of course, as always, to the great Jerry Payne, his Payne Audio Excellence, once again coming through with flying colors. And follow us on the socials. We're doing a lot more on Blue Sky these days. We're at goodseatsstillavailable.com there. You'll find us on the Twitter X thing at goodseatsstill, and just about everywhere else, including YouTube, at goodseatsstillavailable. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next week.